Hi, welcome back to Binkerbell's Yarning. In this particular video, we're going to do knitting for crocheters. So, a few little things on the tools that we're going to be using. So, these are basics on your knitting needles. You have your plastic knitting needles. This particular one happens to be a 7mm, as you can see. So, these are very similar to the way that crochet hooks are sized. So your 7mm knitting needle is going to be approximately the same size as your 7mm hook. This one here just happens to be metal, okay, and on the bottom here you can actually see the US sizing as opposed to the millimeters. So this is a US 8, which is actually a 5.5mm needle. And these ones here happen to be not only a cabled, which is used for very large projects because you can't really jam hundreds of stitches onto straight needles, or double-ended needles. So double-ended needles just means that there's a point on either end of the needle. They're often used to do sock patterns or knitting in the round. I prefer to use a cabled needle when it comes to knitting in the round or doing socks. Just gives me a little bit more control. So on these particular ones, it gives you both the US sizing as well as the millimeter sizing. So a US size 10 and a 6mm needle. Okay. I also prefer to use a wood needle. I just find that the slide is better, and it's a lot lighter than working with a metal needle. And I find that the plastic needles tend to be a little bit cumbersome. That's just me. So yeah, as you know already, when it comes to yarn and picking the type of yarn that you're using for your project, you want to make sure that your sizing in the yarn is equal to the pattern. So if a worsted weight yarn or a fingerling or a DK, depending on the pattern itself, you want to make sure that you follow it for knitting as well as you do for crochet. The needle size here gives you the needle that is recommended for this particular yarn. Some of them, when it comes to a worsted weight, will recommend a 5 or a 5.5 or a 6, depending on how thick the particular worsted is. Same thing goes for DK and bulky. For this particular label, the two sizes are 5mm and 5mm. If it only gives a recommended hook size, then generally speaking, you go down 1 or 2 sizes for your needles. I don't always go by what's recommended. I go by what feels right, because your yarns are going to be different different weights or thicknesses depending on the brand that you choose. So we'll get started on some basics. Now with crochet, I tend to have my yarn going in through my left hand. Now for continental knitting, it's the same. For English knitting, it's actually through the opposite hand, because you're going to throw. But I'll review both types of knitting for that. So as with crochet, you're going to start with a slip stitch. So not a slip, just a slip knot. So we're going to do our tail over like this, and then we're going to pull through the loop like that. Everybody has their own way of doing a slip stitch or a slip knot. This is just the method I prefer. So we're going to put our loop on our needle like this, and we're going to pull it tight, but not too tight, because we will be putting a needle in through these particular loops. So my yarn over to the other side here. I'm going to just move these guys out of the way. We don't get all jammed up in our work. Now, when it comes to casting on, it simply means that you're putting loops onto the hook. Onto the needle. In crochet, you make a chain, which is similar, gives the same idea. It just gives you that base for the number of stitches you're going to need. So, super simple way to cast on is you simply make a loop with your feeder yarn in the back, and then you just put the loop over the needle like this and pull. Not too tight, because you do have to get the other needle through this particular loop. Okay, in subsequent videos we'll go over different types of cast-ons. So we have a long tail cast-on, there's also fancy cast-ons. There's cast-ons for socks, there's just lots of different ones depending on the project that you're doing. But for this particular video, we're just going to do a simple cast-on. Just gets you started with the basics, and it gets you practicing and ready to go. So now that we have our loops on our needle, we're going to do a knit stitch. So we take our other needle and we're going to insert it into this loop from the bottom, and we're going to go to the back of the first needle. Alright, so it looks like this. Okay, and then we're going to grab our yarn, just like we would in crochet, and we're going to yarn over. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this particular piece of yarn, we're going to go around the back of our needles, and we're going to come between them, just like that. Okay, so essentially what you're doing is creating another loop on the second hook, on the second needle. Okay, and then we're going to take our needle and we're going to go over that particular piece of yarn into the front of the loop, and we're going to pull that loop off the needle, off our first needle. Okay, we're going to pull a little bit just to close the stitch, and then we're going to do it again. Insert our needle into the back. Oops. I'm going to go through all of the yarn. There we are. We're going to yarn over, just like that. We're going to slide it down and into that stitch and pull it off. I'm going to do it again. Okay, and this is English knitting, or throwing. So it literally means throwing your yarn around the hook, around the needle, and creating a stitch. Just like that. There we go. Super simple knit stitch. Now for picking, or continental, the first way was English or throwing. This way is called picking, or continental stitching. So our yarn is on the other side. Those that do crochet probably will find this way a little bit easier, simply because it's very similar to the way that you would yarn over with crochet hooks. So again, we're gonna insert our needle into the loop just like we did before. Instead of going around the back of both needles, we're gonna just go around one, like that, and again pull it off. Okay, and we're going to do that, yarn over and pull it off our needle. Insert into the back, just like that, yarn over, and there we are. Yarn over, again, go over top of that, yarn over, under the stitch, and off. Okay, so this is picking, or continental style knitting. And again, for those that crochet, this is probably the easier one, because the yarning over is as similar to crochet yarn overs. So that's the knit stitch. You can do lots of rows of that. It gives a really pretty bumpy kind of look to the piece, and it's the same on both sides, just like that. So the other stitch that you'll use most often is purl. So we're going to go back to English style here so that you can see both English and continental. So for purling, instead of going up the back of the stitch like this, we're going to go down the front of the stitch. Okay, so from the top of the stitch to the front, like this, is how we're going to be doing it. We need to make sure that our yarn is in the front of our work so that we can do a proper yarn over. So we're going to insert into the stitch like this, this particular piece of yarn is then going to go between the two needles like that. And then the same as you would with the knit stitch, create your new loop, and just like that. And as you close the stitch, you'll see that the yarn stays in the front of the work. Again, from the top of the stitch along the front, and again we're going to yarn over just like that, and then pull our loop up, get all of the yarn on the hook, on the needle, there we go, and again it is in the front of our work. We'll just go to the end of our row here. When you're counting rows of stitches in knitting, you count both bumps. So there's always 2 bumps, so 2 rows. And that's counted by 2s. I'll show you in a second. Get to the end of the row. With crochet, you count rows by the number of stitches up, and you can very obviously see how many stitches are in your particular piece because they're well defined. In knitting, it's not as well defined, as you can see. So here, this is one stitch right here, this little loop. This is one row, and then this is the next row. So the one bump is one row. And the easiest way to count your rows is to go by 2s. So you count your top bump 2, and then 4, 6, so on and so forth. So continental for purl, again we're going to switch sides here, but we're going to make sure that our yarn is in the front of our work. We're going to insert just like that, and we're going to pick up our loop and pull it up and over, and my yarn is splitting. There we go, and we're going to take it off our needle just like that, making sure that our yarn is again in front of our work. It's hard to see because that piece gets in the way. Again, we're going to insert along the front, okay. Yarn over, pull it up and off just like that. Now there are other ways of doing purling, which is basically knitting backwards. That is a technique for another video. I don't want to give you too many options and get you too confused on how to do a particular stitch. So we'll just keep it simple, whichever one here that you're comfortable with, continental or English. As you can see, I am more proficient purling English than I am continental. But again, that is simply because of the way that I learned. I learned from a left-hand woman who knitted continental, and it was easier for me to follow her using a throw style or English knitting. Again, I just don't have as much practice with purling in this way. So most patterns will call for some kind of combination of knit and purl. Gives you a different look. Usually one direction is one and the other direction is the other. So you'll knit one row and then you'll purl another, and it gives you an interesting flat look to it. I don't know if you can see it very easily there, but it's a nice flat look when you have knit on one side and purl on the other. Okay. So just finish these last 2 stitches. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, or you want me to review something again, or go into more detail on something, just let me know, and we'll do some more videos, and we'll do some more learning. I have no problem spending as much time with you as you like. Oh, and we're going to yarn over, and we're going to do our last stitch off, just like that. Ta-da! Look at that. Beautiful, right? you just keep going, practicing your knitting and purling, and get a nice sample piece done. All right? Thanks for watching.